Hello and welcome to Confetti's Industry Week 2021. I cannot be more excited for what's about to come. It's a real one-off event. So before I introduce our guests today, just a reminder that you can still book on other talks for the rest of the week using iw.confetti.ac.uk, and remember to share your experiences using the hashtag IW21. Please use the chat room to add your questions. And we'll get through as many as we can, but we are going to have so many questions. Luckily, we've got a very skilled host to steer through the highlights of this gentleman's career. We've got such a unique event for you. We've got a producer and musician partly responsible for some true cornerstones of popular music. And to host that, we've got an award-winning broadcaster and self-proclaimed music nut. So, without further ado, can I hand over to our guests, Tony Visconti, hosted by Adam Buxton.
Hi. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Tony. It's a great pleasure to meet you. We've just been sitting in a virtual green room, not knowing whether we should speak or not, whether it'll ruin everything if we just converse like normal human beings. But I'm very excited to be here and to get to talk to you for a little bit. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Should be fun.
Well, let's see how it goes. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. It could be very awkward. There could be a big virtual bust up, and who knows? But let's. I'm going to try, and what I thought I could do was go through an introduction for you, and you could jump in at various points. If any of the introduction is wrong, if I've missed anything, if there's anything that you can add, that kind of thing. How do you feel about that?
Okay, that's fine.
All right, so this is our jumping off point. Tony Visconti, currently aged 76. Hope you don't mind me saying. I always tell my podcast listeners the age of my guests. I mean, you may I say, if I look like you, if I make it to 76 and I look like you, I'll be very happy. I thought you took loads of drugs in the 60s. How come you look so good?
I stopped taking the drugs.
That's the secret. Tony grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and began playing in bands around the age of 15. Quickly became one of the most sought-after guitarists on the New York live scene in the early 60s. Moved to London in 1968 after being invited to help produce jazz vocalist Georgie Fame. And just a few months later, he had met and began working with Mark Bolan and his band Tyrannosaurus Rex. Later,
it was 67.
That was 67. So you were even younger at that point than I thought you were.
Yeah.
The band Tyrannosaurus Rex, later shortened to T-Rex, because let's face it, who wants to type, let alone write by hand, the word Tyrannosaurus over and over again, if they don't have to. Tony produced 8 massively influential albums for T-Rex over a period at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, when he was also cultivating a working relationship with another exciting young British musician, David Jones, who had recently adopted the stage name David Bowie. At this point, you were playing bass still, and one of the bands that you played bass in was a short-lived combo called The Hype. And also in that band were David Bowie, Mick Ronson, John Cambridge playing drums. Later on, John Cambridge was replaced by Woody Woodmansey, who later was the drummer for the Spiders. And that core musical unit would record Bowie's album, The Man Who Sold the World, on which Tony played bass, and he produced the album as well. And I've also heard that actually you, Mick Ronson, and Woody Woodmansey were really involved quite a lot with the songwriting on there, and a lot of the musicianship, the instrumentation, and the composition of those songs. Is that right?
Yes, David was, of course, the composer of the songs, and he would write them on his 12-string guitar, which he had for many years. That was part of his sound, and that was the part I was attracted to, is that he could do many things. He could do West End musicals and be a tenor or a baritone singing "What Kind of Fool Am I?" and like Anthony Newley music. But what I thought he was very consistent in was that he wrote and accompanied himself on the 12-string guitar, and we built that band around his abilities. He and I, after making the Space Oddity album, felt that we needed to be a rock band. There was like we were doing kind of folk rock. The 12-string was a little too much to the fore, and we thought, if we got some nice musicians to work with, we would make a big sound like Cream or like the Who, and we found very fortunately, we found Mick Ronson. And Mick Ronson guided us to Woody Woodmansey, which was the final. We were the power trio that was going to accompany him. And that turned out extremely well because he felt that once he wrote the songs, his job was mainly done. He relied on us to take them to that level of hard rock. And that's what we approached. I mean, Mick Ronson was really the expert. And I was a very competent bass player, but he directed me to listen to Cream and to listen to Jack Bruce play bass. He said, if you and I are going to be in the same band, you have to listen to Jack Bruce and play like him. So I did. I did a little weekend workshop and figured out that it was actually lead bass playing. It wasn't fundamental bass playing. You're playing lead when you play that style, just like Mick was playing lead guitar. And it was interesting because once we started practicing, we found that we could even drop the chords of a song, because if I was playing a bass line with a lot of the chordal notes in it and passing tones, Mick could do the same thing on his solos. So we were exploring territories that were pretty much brand new in the field of rock instead of just power chords. But we had all those things at our disposal: the power chords, the searing lead guitar vocals. Woody was one of the loudest drummers I had ever worked with to date. Like, it was deafening in the control room, and Mick had us turn all our amps up to 11. This is before Spinal Tap.
It's a very hard-edged album. I mean, even now you can listen to it, and some of it sounds like a four-figuring, if that's a word, a prefiguring of punk. It's so hard-edged. I'm thinking of songs like She Shook Me Cold and bits of Width of a Circle, which manages to be, it's half proggy, and it's also got, kind of boogie elements, and it's a real mashup of styles, but very hard-edged production, really big. And also, you've got some of the experimentation in there that Bowie would return to throughout his career, especially I'm thinking of the vari speed. He'd already used that in The Laughing Gnome, though, hadn't he, at that point?
Yeah, well, the vari speed goes back to Les Paul in the 50s. Vari speed was one of the first things people figured out that you could do with a tape recorder that was not true to real life. But that wasn't so much of the technical part of making that album. Was pretty much straightforward, although in the mix we employed some fairly new techniques. I was a mixing engineer in those days as well. But what made the difference was we were playing hard rock, but David was writing these very romantic chord changes. Like, there's a song called After All. I mean, that's quite a complicated little guitar piece in its own. And that's what made this group different from other rock groups, that we had a guy who had the knowledge of Cole Porter. He was listening to generations before rock and roll was invented, and he had this sense of chord changes that were unexpected. Like, he would use a dramatic key changer in the middle of a song. He'd go into another key for maybe the chorus. No one was doing this at the time. And even till recent times, when I worked with David in this very room, he once interrupted our conversation, said, I do write great chord changes, don't I? And I said, yes, you do. You write the best chord changes there are. So that's why that was a big quirky situation that turned out to, it gave birth to his whole career, really. That was the springboard to the rest of his career, that album.
It's a tremendous album, The Man Who Sold the World. And I'm going to whiz through this. We'll return to various bits and pieces, some of the things I've already mentioned, but this is the continuing sketch of your career thus far. So a few years later, 1974, I think, you were asked by David to help him mix his album Diamond Dogs. And then you were invited back to produce another 5 Bowie albums during the 70s. And that included, of course, the famous so-called Berlin trilogy of albums that included Low, Heroes, and Lodger, each of which also featured creative input from Brian Eno. And I've made a sketch about that. I don't know if you ever saw that, Tony. There's an animated thing that I did that's
You
on.
did that?
Yeah.
I'm not speaking to.
So I don't know. Maybe they didn't warn you that I was.
Now I know who you are. Oh, that's very funny. I love it, actually. It's very, very funny.
Good. Well, I wasn't sure. For those who haven't seen the sketch, you can find it on YouTube. It's called, I think it's called Bowie, Visconti, and Eno Record Vassava, or something like that. And the sketch was made for a show I did, a Bowie special, around the time of the V&A exhibition in 2013. And in my mind, it was a joke about the fact that so many people had assumed wrongly that Brian Eno was the person that produced some of those 70s albums, those Berlin Trilogy albums. And in my mind, I was thinking, what would it be like for Tony Visconti, who really produced those records, to constantly be butting up against people who had that misconception? And so yeah, that's
Well,
sketch.
thank you. I really appreciate it. There's not producers didn't have the same platform as an artist, and Eno was also an artist, from Roxy Music and all that. But I had to, the truth is, and I love Brian and till this day, and I'll always work with him. He only spent 2 weeks on those projects. He would come for the first 2 weeks. He and David wrote the songs, so it was important that he be there and put all his ideas down on his little synthy, his portable briefcase synthesizer. And then he'd leave onto his next project, and David and I would finish the rest of the albums and the rest of the music on each album. And I think shortly around that time, David started calling himself the co-producer. That I totally approve of. I mean, David's produced Mott the Hoople and other things. He was really a great record producer in his own right. I didn't mind sharing the credit with him, but anyway, dear Brian put the record straight as well years later. He says, no, it's, blah, blah, blah. It's Tony and David worked on the whole thing and all that. So anyway, I'm happy that you did that. And thanks for bringing that up.
Good. Well, I worried about the idea that people would, that you would be offended by it, or you'd think I was taking the piss, because, that was the furthest thing from my mind. After the release of Scary Monsters in 1980, you didn't work with Bowie for around 22 years or something. And, but you teamed up again towards the beginning of the 2010s in 2002. And then after a couple of albums with Bowie, he then went on a nearly 10-year hiatus, at the end of which you worked with him on another 2 records, the last of which, Black Star, was released just before his death in January 2016. It earned you a Grammy for that year's Best Engineered Album. It won another 3. And it was, in every sense, a fitting end to one of the most fruitful artistic collaborations in musical history. Over the years, however, Tony has, I'm sort of shifting from addressing you, Tony, to doing my intro in the third person. Tony has continued to work with an impressive diversity of other artists, including Sparks, Thin Lizzy, the Moody Blues, Iggy Pop, Hazel O'Connor, the Stranglers, Prefab Sprout, the Manic Street Preachers, Morrissey, back in his relatively inoffensive days, and Damon Albarn's supergroup. Well, it's not just him. The Good, the Bad, and the Queen. That's just a few. I mean, there's so many more. So there you go. There's my introduction. We're now going to sort of jump around to various parts within that. I want to ask you, first of all, Do you have an idea of what it is that characterizes a Tony Visconti production?
What I'm told I do is I make the artists sound more like themselves by bringing out all their qualities and putting them to work. I mean, uh, David always shied away from, like when he worked with fabulous musicians, he said, "Oh, I don't want to play keyboard. They can play much better than me and all that." But he's better when he plays his own stuff. It's straight from his brain to his fingertips. And so I, I think I brought, not only his, like everything he wants to do to fruition, I made him feel more involved in his own productions. And I did that. I do that with everyone I work with. I like to keep the team immediate and close, and only get outside people in if we absolutely need them. And that might be in the form of a string section or something like that. But if I've got a room full of 4 or 5 people, I know there's hidden talents I don't know about, and they might be too shy to talk about. But that's the way I work. I bring out the best in artists, and the other part too of that answer is I know what I'm doing. I'm doing this a real long time, so I'm fast. I'm very, very, very fast in the studio. There's no mysteries. If there's something I've heard that somebody wants and they play it to me, I said, I know how that was done. So, that's, you just get that from experience. So I'm not big-headed in any way.
Okay, I'm going to sketch out a scenario, which is that I am an amazing musician and you have agreed to produce my new album. I come in with a set of demos that I've recorded. I play them to you. You're knocked out. You've never heard anything so great. But they're all put together on Logic using VSTs, and I've just sung over the top of them. So what is the process from there? Talk me through, basically in rough terms, how we get to actually recording those songs.
Well, you're talking about a very modern situation. A lot of people, can have a recording studio on their laptop, a very inexpensive laptop, and there's no shortage of free applications. This has really changed the whole playing ground. Whereas professionals like myself learned the hard way on analog equipment, on big consoles with faders and all that. But I'm not really attached to that. I'm always was a fan of the music itself. I'm not doing this to play with toys. I'm doing this to have a great musical experience. And I can only have that with very talented people. So if you did this thing and you have your files on your computer and I'm really knocked out by you, I'll just take those files from you and we'll come to my studio and we'll build up on that. And I might convince you to use a real drummer, things like that, and I could see ways to make it really impactful and have the public get it, so that's that. I would do that. I work like that now with everyone.
And do you have a set routine? Do you always start by laying down a rhythm track, for example, or anything like that?
Well, that is the best way to start if it's a group sound, if you want to have a drums, bass, guitar, and all that. But a lot of tracks are click based or loop based. So it's easy to drag a loop onto your desktop and have it go on for about 4 minutes and write a song over it. And, some people get so attached to that loop that that's the way it's eventually the public is going to hear it, with the loop. My feelings about that is I like you to create everything. I like everything to be created from scratch. I think the loops are good for working on a song, but why not come up with your own loop, invent your own loop, get a drummer to play something. Like, for instance, when you're trying to if you're not a drummer and you try to make loops and all that, a drummer can walk in the studio and in 5 minutes do something better than you could ever think of. And the same way is like if you're not a great pianist and you go ding, 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 and little by little you add notes, just call in someone like Henry Hay, who I often work with, David Bowie, and he'll just like ripple a few Rachmaninoff pieces, and then he'll sit down and he'll boogie, but So I think that's something that everyone who works at home should consider, is to expand your world into people probably in your own neighborhood that can play real instruments. And that makes for better music. It really does.
And how do you feel? I mean, I think I've got a sense of the fact that you particularly enjoy analog recording. In 2016, you partnered with Kingston University to create Visconti Studio, which is a tape-based recording studio. Do you think that in the digital age we've lost something? I'm thinking particularly about the need to make decisions and commit to decisions that existed in analog days when there were a limited number of tracks, and yeah, you could bounce a few times, but
Yeah.
there were limitations. Do you think those limitations have been lost to the detriment of music in the digital age?
Well, the limitations of tape, we all romanticize about how beautiful it sounds, and it does. You know, tape, honestly, it has a nice, smoother sound than digital. The way I get over that is, like, I record a lot at very high sampling rates, 88.2 kilohertz or 96 kilohertz. I've got a demon fast computer, so it doesn't clog the arteries of my computer. But going back to your question, you couldn't fix anything when you recorded on tape. You had to be a good musician. You had to make no mistakes. And so if you flubbed a little guitar note and all that, you couldn't drag a note in and fix it like you can now. You had to replay the solo until you got it right. And even drummers were loath to work with any kind of a click track back in the early days. So the best drummers who rose to the top were people who had a natural metronome in their brains. I mean, one of David's longtime drummers was a guy called Dennis Davis. He
Mhm.
he had a clock in his brain. I did a live track. I made a live album with Dennis, and it was, I think, Station to Station was the track that I was mixing, and the track in Boston was good, but they made mistakes on it, and the track in Rhode Island was the best. The way they performed it in Rhode Island was the best. And I said, well, I hope Dennis played the same tempo, because he didn't use a metronome or a click track. And when I edited the two pieces together, you wouldn't even know that it was two different cities, because that's the kind of guy Dennis was. But there were lots of uh, drummers I worked with in the 70s who rose to the occasion, who could play really, really, really well. And I mean, nowadays drummers can play with click tracks. They've learned to tolerate it, but I still, prefer the old way. And if you record a drummer without a click track, you can always, I know in Pro Tools, I can always generate a timeline. I could always, with the beat, generate a click track that was based on the drummer's timing. It'll just little variations, but if you need to do that. I mean, we have everything available now, but the limitations, like getting back to your question, of analog meant that only the best people made the best records, and there were no tricks. Producer would keep everyone herded together and choraled and make sure, and put his fist down or her fist down and say, you can do it better, you can do it better. That's what production was in the old days. You were more of a coach than a technician.
Yeah. I mean, there's something nice, though, don't you think? Or do you think it's weird that people with much less formal musical talent are now able to make their own music? It's a sort of different kind of music. There's definitely a difference between a composer in the old school sense who could read music and understood chords and understood the sort of science of music, as it were, and someone now who's a kind of laptop warrior.
Well, in all seriousness, David wasn't a trained musician. He never learned to read music. David Bowie. None of the Beatles could read music. I don't think any of the Rolling Stones could read music. But the mind worked differently in those days. They were closer to where people wrote great songs. They grew up listening to their parents' records. David grew up listening to Cole Porter songs that his father put on the gramophone and all that. But today's people who are writing with no musical training whatsoever, kind of, they're not exposed to great music. So they've invented like metronomic, computerized, loop-based songs using the, you'll have to open up your music dictionary, the pentatonic scale, 5 notes where you have 11 notes of a scale, between C and C, there's 11 notes before the C is repeated again. Most pop music is written around 5 notes and a loop. So of course it sounds to me very unimaginative. And then once people start fixing their voice with vocal, with what is that thing called, auto-tune and all that, Melodyne, then they turn their voice into a piano-like instrument.
Right.
This is good for a novelty. It's good for a while, but I think I'm looking forward to a revolution where people use chords again and people want to play real stuff. I don't put it down. Look, I've got a computer right here. I've got a laptop. I've got Pro Tools, Logic. I've given up on Ableton, but I like to do all that stuff. It's great for me, great arranging tools. But as an older producer, I would like to replace all that with real musicians who can play very, very well.
Yes. You mentioned the concept of novelty music there. And I wanted to ask you about the journey from one David Bowie song to another. Forgive me as well for focusing a lot on Bowie. I am a massive fan of his, and I am aware that you've done so much other great music, but we're going to talk about this if that's okay. And that is the journey from the song Space Oddity to the song Ashes to Ashes, which are very important in Bowie's canon, and the Ashes to Ashes is kind of a spiritual sequel to Space Oddity. But originally, of course, and I've heard you talking about this before, you passed on the song Space Oddity as a producer. And maybe you could explain for people who haven't heard you talking about that, why?
Well, when I met him, I said the thing he did best was write great songs and accompany himself on acoustic guitar. And we had planned the so-called Space Oddity album without the song Space Oddity on it. We had it all rehearsed, all planned, and all that. And I have to add that I was not that experienced in those days. I wasn't flexible. I was producing by the seat of my pants and biting my nails and all that. And he just brought in this new song called Space Oddity, which he wrote partially on the guitar and partially on the stylophone. Does anyone know what a stylophone is? I mean,
Sure.
I've got 6 of them over there. And I said to him, it's just out of character with the rest of the album. And I said, it sounds like a novelty to me. I mean, I know the radio will play it, but how are you going to follow that up? And we had this argument, and he listened to me very seriously. I mean, we were good friends, and he trusted me, and I trusted him. I wasn't frightened of him or anything. If he didn't want to work with me, so what? I was working with Mark Bolan and all that. But anyway, I spoke my mind, and he came back to me and he said, well, he goes, the label wants me to record it, and if you don't want to do it, I'll get Gus Dudgeon to do it, who we both knew. He's a friend of ours, an engineer that eventually worked with made great Elton John records. Gus was a good mate. I worked with Gus as a string arranger and all that. So it was in the family. So David went off and did the track. And when I heard it, I thought it was fantastic. Once I heard it done like that, and I went, wow. And I turned to David, almost like choking up. And I said, that was great. He did such a great job. Maybe you should do this album with Gus. And he goes, oh, no. I just had to get that out of the way. I want to work with you. So this is, if you want to know like anything about my relationship with David, we were friends from the start. For him to do a thing like that was completely out of friendship, and he respected my opinion and still wanted to work with me after that. So, and I'll tell you, years later, every time I hear Space Oddity, I had to remix it about 10 times for different projects and all that. I think it's fantastic. Now I really, really love it. And you can see it in the arc of his career where it belonged and how it started out everything. But, I was right. He couldn't follow it up. It took him about 2 years to follow it up.
Yeah.
With a thing called Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah. I was wondering if your reticence about it had anything to do with the fact that you yourself had been you'd recorded a kind of a novelty song with your wife, Siegfried, in Siegfried, I'm sorry, not Siegfried.
Sigrid.
Sigrid. I'm so sorry. I'm confusing her with, I've got in my head Siegfried and Roy and
The Lion Tamers, yeah.
wasn't one of them.
Not her. She wasn't a lion tamer.
Sigrid. In 1966, you had a track called Long Hair that you did together, which was kind of a riposte to people who would shake their heads when they saw young people with long hair in those days. And it's got...
Well,
yeah.
It turned out a little, it was a good song. We did it live on an acoustic guitar and 2 vocals, and it really went down in our live show. But the producer turned it into a joke. It sounded like it was a merry-go-round calliope, and
Right.
That's not what we wanted. But that was my first experience working with an asshole producer, and I vowed not to be an asshole producer for the rest of my life.
Okay.
Don't play that. I hope you're not going to play it.
No, you can find it on YouTube if
Oh.
you're interested. And
I'm going to blow up YouTube in that case.
at the moment, it only has about 35 listens. The copy.
Oh, good.
Quite entertaining though. So in 1979, before, I think I'm right in saying, work had started on the Scary Monsters album, Bowie asked you to get together a group of musicians who would record some tracks for the Kenny Everett TV show. It was a New Year's Eve special. It was called something like Will Kenny Make It to 1980? And David Mallet, who was the director on the show and had directed a few videos for tracks from Lodger for Bowie, he suggested that Bowie do a version of Space Oddity. And so you got together a band that included, do you remember who was on that session?
Yeah, Zane Griff was the bass player.
He's a Kiwi musician that you were working with, is that right?
Yes, and he was a Bowie kind of wannabe. No, well, I shouldn't say that wannabe. He looked like Bowie. He dressed like him. He like the Ziggy, and I hired him because not only is he a great musician and my friend, but I wanted to see them look at each other face to face. I did that for very nefarious reasons. But the drummer was Andy Duncan, right?
Yep.
Andy Duncan, my dear old friend. That's all I could remember is bass and drums.
According to the internet, the piano player was Hans Zimmer.
Ah, of course he was. Yeah. Yes.
So that was the same Hans Zimmer that is now the well-known composer for films, right?
Yeah, of course. Hans and I were really good friends in those days. He had the first computer-based sequencer, and something by a company named Roland. It was the something 4. He could program 4 different MIDI channels and start out that whole dance thing, the whole. He started the whole thing out. Then he graduated to an 8 channel one, which. But if you wanted anything sequenced, Zane Griff turned me on to Hans. Hans was the only guy in London who could sequence something. And, this was a new thing. Now we can all do this, program and sequence. So Hans would come in with this enormous machine, and he was also, a keyboard player as well. So he was my go-to guy for a few things.
Yeah. Well, the band produced a really lovely set of versions of Bowie tracks for that Kenny Everett show, including this great stripped down version of Space Oddity that sounds like something off Lennon's Plastic Ono album, like a track called Isolation, it reminds me of.
Yeah.
And it's terrific. And Bowie was sufficiently pleased with the results that he, as far as I have read, was inspired to write a sequel to Space Oddity. And that turned out to be the song Ashes to Ashes, which is the centerpiece of the Scary Monsters album. And I think just about one of the best songs he ever wrote. And it is an amazing sounding record that resonated with me as soon as I heard it. I heard it when the album came out in 1980. I was aged 10. And it was one of the first bits of music that really obsessed me. Partly, I think, looking back, because I couldn't place any of the instruments. I didn't know what I was listening to. So you've got this song about the spaced out spaceman and what he's doing now, and it sounds very otherworldly. So I'm interested to know how you approached putting together the music for that and how you produced it, because it's such a widescreen sound, like the moods in the middle eight. I've never done good things, never done bad things. It's so emotional, and it's all building from all these textures that you've created on there. So that's a very vague request for information about Ashes to Ashes.
Well, by the time we recorded Ashes to Ashes, David was quite fond of not committing to any lyrics. He had loads of musical ideas. David Bowie was always a great musician. He had lots of musical ideas, and he always wanted to experiment. And we always prefaced every album, the beginning of every album, saying, if this doesn't work out, we'll make demos. These are all going to be demos. We have never not used the demo. We've always used the demo. The demos eventually evolved, but I think we were just protecting ourselves from telling everyone, yeah, we're making an album. So this was an experimental session in New York City. We hired Dennis and George Murray on bass, and I don't know what it had a working title. The working title was "People Are Turning to Gold." That's all he could think of. People are turning to gold, and that evokes quite an image, But it ended up as Ashes to Ashes. So when we were doing all these textural things, like that goofy piano sound on the intro, that's a straight up Baldwin grand piano in the studio. Big full grand piano. The thing is, we ordered a stereo Wurlitzer, and it arrived in the studio from the hiring company, the rental company. It hired it with a broken right channel. So we couldn't get that dong, we couldn't do the quick left and right stereo panning that we wanted. So I was good friends with the Eventide company, who made the harmonizer and the instant flanger and the instant phaser and all that. And I said, I think I can emulate a normal piano. There was no other electric piano in the studio. I said, you go play that, told Roy Bittan, play that on a regular piano, and I'm going to fool around with this thing, this instant flanger. And basically, it's like almost all the knobs to the right at 11, And instead of flanging is usually a slow, like that, a very slow waving pitch played against a steady pitch. That's what flanging is. So one machine is steady, the other is going up and down in speed. I made it go ridiculously up and down very, very quickly, almost like vibrato. But this was pitch vibrato, not normal guitar amp vibrato, It's a technical explanation, but that dong, 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 it almost sounds like a koto, Japanese koto with the wiggling. So we were on a roll here with how do we make the most unusual sounds we can on this song called "People Are Turning to Gold." The other one was a magnificent guitarist came to our attention. You probably have it in front of you, but he played synth guitar.
Chuck Hammer.
Chuck Hammer, yeah. His manager approached us and said, Chuck would like to show you this synth guitar thing. So he brought it in. And, it was a guitar with all kinds of other things on it. And he strummed a chord, and out came a string section. And this is 1979. David and I looked at each other and wow, that's incredible. And, he could get anything out of that thing apart from a guitar sound. So I took it a step further. It wasn't quite, it was mono, and it wasn't quite stereo enough. It wasn't magic enough, even though it was basically you're hearing a string patch come out of a guitar. That alone wasn't enough for me. So we put his amp in the hallway behind the control room. And this was a fire hallway where you escape in a fire. It's a big, long, many steps that go down to the ground floor. And I put a microphone on the floor above us and a microphone on the floor below us. And that was our stereo, even though it was vertical. It sounded like, horizontal. That was our stereo for Chuck Hammer's guitar. And we just continued to do goofy stuff like that. and just throw it on the tape. And I mean, if you want to bring one else, another aspect, I can't think of anything else, but these are two major things that we just had absolute fun making. And then we just turned everything off for 3 months, 2.5 months. This ended in February, and I think 1980, maybe I'm wrong by a year. And then we reconvened in April. This song for 2.5 months was still called "People Are Turning to Gold." So we reconvened in my studio in London, in Soho, Good Earth Studios. And David said, let's pull up that "People Are Turning to Gold" song. I've got some lyrics. And he started singing "Ashes to Ashes." So this was, again, very unlike him. He would usually go out into the lobby and write some lyrics, but he spent a lot of time. He wanted the 2 months to write all the lyrics for Scary Monsters, and that's why it is such a good album. We used to make our albums very quickly. A Bowie album prior to that, even something like Heroes, was never longer than a 4-week project, never longer than 4 weeks. But this one spanned a few months, and each time we spent 2.5 weeks in New York, and then many more weeks in my studio in London doing the vocals, doing more overdubs, getting that lovely Japanese lady into the studio. She worked at the London Palladium, and all those wacky things we further did. So that was we spent a good 6 months making Scary Monsters. We set a new record for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, it's time well spent. And I always wondered as well, like, the mumbling in the back of Ashes to Ashes, and that you can sort of hear him kind of chatting away and saying sort of stuff. You can't quite make it out.
I'll tell you what he's saying. I never done good things. I never done bad things. I never done anything out of the blue. He's just mumbling the lyrics.
Right, okay.
That he's singing on top. I'll play it for it.
All right. Now, listen, I am looking at the clock, and I am aware of the fact that we only have a limited amount of time, and people are very keen to ask questions.
Sure.
So at this point, I'm going to throw across to our mediator and take a few questions, and then maybe I'll be able to ask you a few more of mine in the meantime.
Oh, okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so far. We're halfway through Industry Week at Confetti 2021, and thanks for everything you're doing so far. Yeah, we'll take a few questions and then throw it back over to you, Adam. We've had so many questions. We are never going to get through them all, so I'm going to try and choose some of the choice ones that will get the most value out of her, hopefully. We have a lot of people asking around the advice that you would give to yourself as a 16, 17, 18-year-old getting into the industry now, Tony. What advice would you give them that they could take forward?
Well, that's hard, because this is a different world from the world I started out in. Although it was just as competitive. To open the door of a big company, that a big recording company or publishing company, to get that door open for you. I mean, I was as if I had a good manager, and a good break to get into the business. I had a lot of experience. I think that's probably, once the door opened a crack, I was able to get in and prove myself rather quickly, because if I was no good, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. So I started my musical career at age 11. That's actually the first gig I ever had in my life, and it was at an Italian wedding. I played guitar for about half an hour, and I made $5. And I was already taking guitar lessons for a few years. So by the time I was 18 years old, I had now acquired, I was playing bass, upright, double bass, electric bass. I could read and write music. I played in different bands in my neighborhood, and I was making demos in my parents' house using the stairwell in our apartment for the reverb. I knew records had reverbs on it. So by the time I walked in the door of a publisher and I'm playing him my demos, they were pretty slick for somebody who spent very little time in a recording studio, but had a good imagination. And it was just kind of luck, but I was at the right place at the right time. And as I said, I had experience. The experience is the important part. And I got a job. I was offered to be the house record producer when my demos were rejected. He says, I don't like your songs. He says, my songs were rejected. He said, I like your demos. You're going to be my house record producer. You know, that's the luck that I had right at the beginning of my life. And that is not to say you can't have the same luck, but doors will open. And you, like right where you're sitting now, I know that record labels go to universities and they want to see who the top students are. You know, they do have their eye out because they know what they have to do. You know, the job of a record label is to create new music. And so I can't emphasize enough how well you should be prepared for that opportunity should it arise. And you know, label, you don't really send stuff to labels. It goes into a bin. They ask other people to listen to it. A record label will get about 1,000 demos a week. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I don't think I'm far wrong. But it helps to meet people who know people who know people. That's a good way to start. It's always that personal introduction when you could meet someone face to face, then you have your 10 minutes to prove yourself, your 15 minutes to prove yourself. You know what people do to me, and I don't mind this at all. When I do gigs with my band, I'd say about 10% of the audience are musicians, and they come up to me afterwards and they hand me a CD. In the old days, it was a cassette, or now sometimes I get a USB drive, and it's their songs. And I do listen to everything. And if I hear something I like, I will write back to the person and give them some encouragement. Maybe if it's really exceptionally good, I will bother a friend of mine in the music business saying, you should listen to this.
What are the things that keep you listening, and what are the things that make you switch off?
Oh, well, I keep listening because I love my job and I love music. I turn music on from the minute I wake up in the morning. I've got several radio stations I flick back and forth from and between. On my way to work, I listen to my phone. I listen to music on my phone. And I'm always open. I tell everybody I'm always open to new music. I want to hear new music and I want to hear what people are doing. And I like to work. I just like to work on making music. That's what turns me on.
Yeah, but specifically with demos, I was thinking, when you're listening to something, what is it that makes you listen right to the end and think, actually, this is pretty good?
I don't listen right to the end.
Right.
I don't have the time. I'll tell you something. If I hear a demo and if I don't like the first minute, I don't see where it's going. And then if I do like it, I will listen to the end. You know, it's some people write a lot of awful music too. You know, that's the sad fact.
All right, let's take another question.
Thank you. Just amalgamating quite a few questions together. A lot of our audience are trying to find the inspiration behind what you do, Tony. So have you got any producers and artists that have inspired you over your career, and currently what sort of things are inspiring you musically?
I don't really listen to producers as much as I want to know what they did with the art. The artist is who I listen to. I love great music. I know a lot of producers aren't like me. The only one I modeled my life after was George Martin, and I know that everyone he worked with, he would roll his sleeves up and get involved. And he did it in a way. I mean, you've seen George Martin wearing a suit and a tie, and he had this lovely flowing white hair like Gandalf the Wizard. You know, he was a charming man as well as a smart man. But you know, the Beatles were the proof of the pudding in his case. I'm only inspired by great records, and I don't really much look at who the producer was. I'm not being arrogant. It's just that it doesn't turn me on. That it's like the first producer I was aware of was Phil Spector, and his record sounded like him. But tell me one producer who's got really a real signature these days. They really don't. And in some respects, you really shouldn't have too much of a signature. You lose your adaptability, your flexibility. You know, if you have a one sound thing, it's going to be outdated in a year anyway. So keep floating, keep floating.
I've got another one which is a bit more of a geeky one. So in terms of equipment you use. It might be a vocal chain, or it might be a recording technique which you use that you've developed over the years that you could pass a tip on to our geeky techs.
Well, I'm surrounded by all my equipment. I have Avalon equipment, which I've got the Avalon 737, VT737, which was the go-to preamp for Bowie's voice. We discovered it in a studio 20 years ago during making Heathen, and I was so convinced that this was like the perfect preamp for him. So I have that in my studio. And it's got a valve in it, and I've replaced the valve once. Very proud of myself in the past 22 years. And then I bought Avalon's valve 2-channel preamp just for synthesizers and anything that's any stereo instrument. It goes into that, and I love the selection of tones that are valve based in that preamp. I mean, these things are expensive, but they're not top of the line like Telefunken equipment, But for me, it's like, maybe above medium price. Then I've got I'm surrounded by different preamps like Focusrite, and I know what they sound like. They sound like when you take a different violin, all violins sound a little different. And I know what my preamps sound like. But I would say, you can get great, inexpensive equipment now that it's made to higher standards than years ago because everything's done, everything's on a chip now. And I'd say the most important thing is to get a good microphone first. If you have to buy one thing for your studio, buy a good condenser microphone. And they come in all shapes and sizes now. And some of the cheap ones are surprisingly good. Even like the ones made in China and all that, they just ripped off the design of the ones made in Austria, and we all know that, don't we?
Thank you. Tony, do you ever think about the legacy that you're leaving behind? And if so, what do you want people to think about you with regards to as a producer and a musician?
Well, I already get feedback like you created the music to the soundtrack of my life. A lot of people tell me that, and I've heard it many times, and I appreciate that. I really, really appreciate that. I know I've made a lot of classic records that people grew up with, like the T-Rex mob. So many people grew up with Mark Bolan and T-Rex. People grew up with Bowie. People grew up with Morrissey. And I'm behind I'm behind a lot of those records. And I think when I leave this mortal coil, I hope people will say Visconti's produced the soundtrack of my life. I like that one.
Indeed.
Or didn't, I don't care really.
I think it'd be quite nice to have a little clip of some Mark Bolan. We've got something to play 30 seconds of.
Okay.
But she's faster than rust and she lives on the coast. I'm a two-penny prince and I give her hot love. Take it down, Eva.
Tony, those records sound like they were made in the future and it was 40 to 50 years ago. And you stayed with T-Rex over a number of years. We've got a lot of questions about Mark Bolan. Some fans coming out of the woodwork for sure. So how did you see that sound developing? And when you were making those records, did you have an eye on the future or just do what comes naturally to you?
By the way, that version of Hot Love that you just played, that was actually the record, and because it had the strings on it and all that. Mark was miming to that, but anyway, I just wanted to make a point of that. When I met Mark, I just fell in love with him. He was in a duo then. He was in a folk duo called Tyrannosaurus Rex, as you pointed out earlier. And he was just so special. I found that his voice was unlike any other voice I've ever heard. And I was always attracted to people with unusual voices, even when early, like I loved Fats Domino, I loved Little Richard, I loved Elvis, and then in my jazz days, I loved like John Hendricks. And I mean, people who had different, unique voices really attracted me. And for the first time in London, when I was talent scouting, I actually heard someone with a different, unique voice, and that was Mark. And I honestly, he had such a stylized way of singing in English in those days. I thought he was actually singing in French. I mean, I couldn't understand what he was saying in the club, but his voice carried the weight of those words somehow. And I introduced myself after I met him, and I was just happy to, I wasn't up to scratch. I wasn't really a rock record producer yet. I wasn't really that good with producing drums, bass, guitar, and the whole thing, but I could handle two people, and I could handle a little acoustic guitar, and I could handle bongo drums. So Mark and I grew together. That's pretty much all he was up to himself. And for three albums, we made acoustic-based albums. Sneaked in a drum kit, I think on Unicorn, when we got a Chad Valley drum kit from Hamley's on Oxford Street. We got a toy drum kit, which we detuned it. I mean, the tom was this big, tom-toms are this big, but we detuned it. We got a kick-ass drum sound on that track, Cat Black, the Wizard's Hat. That's quite an amazing song. But then Mark and I, we knew what we had to do next. We got hit records. We had a ceiling of 25 to 30,000 sales every album, which wasn't bad in those days. It certainly made a profit for the record label. And then we had to get more musicians involved. And the first one was me. I came and played bass for a few T-Rex gigs when Mickey Finn joined. We did a couple of shows where I stood on the stage and played bass for a few songs. And at the second show, Steve Curry was watching me from the wings. Mark said, that guy Steve is going to play bass in my group, but I want him to watch the master play bass. That's his words, not mine. So I said, okay. And so Steve's watching when I'm playing. Meanwhile, Steve turned out to be one of the greatest bass players I ever worked with. He was a jazz musician. So that it just consciously, semi-consciously grew to the fact that we had to be a pop band and we had to make rock and roll records. And with Hot Love, that's when it really happened. We had a nice little chart breaker with Ride a White Swan, which went up to number 2. But we needed a drummer, we needed a bass player full-time, and Hot Love is the record that really did amazingly well. That song was number 1 for 7 weeks in the UK, and sold, I don't know, I don't know what record sales were in those days, but it sold over 1 million, definitely, in the UK alone.
And still sounds amazing today, Tony. Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, I agree. I remember the first time I heard that song, it just made me happy. The idea of you all in the studio just going, it should go on for longer. There should be one more of these that goes round again.
That's what happened.
To take you back to another Bowie production, if you don't mind, right at the end of his career during the production of Black Star, and the track No Plan, which I guess was one of the last ever Bowie releases. Was it a B-side? Was it on the Lazarus EP?
Yes, No Plan was written quite early, actually, and it was waiting for a lyric, which never manifested. So it was just beautiful piece of music just hanging around there. And I think just about everything from all the Black Star session has been released now. There could be one that hasn't been, I can't remember.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about those sessions, but maybe we could play a little clip from No Plan if we have one.
Sure.
I think that.
Well,
am I supposed to fire it off, or do you have it over there, team?
We have it.
You have.
We have it. It's coming.
It's coming. I think it's one of the loveliest songs he ever did. And I suppose it's very hard to separate it from the fact that, you know, it came at the end of his life. And I'm interested to know what the chronology was. Like when he wrote those lyrics and when he recorded that vocal, did he know that he was ill and did he know that he didn't have much time left?
Well, I'm going to be brief because I'm not permitted to talk too much about that
Okay.
period. I've signed a non-disclosure agreement,
Mhm.
but I will say that he was happy as I've ever seen him making Black Star. He was so thrilled to be realizing that he was going to make music with some jazz musicians. This was, you know, the first album he really used an entire group made up of jazz musicians. And again, I've never seen him happier. I knew he was ill, and a cure was what we were all waiting for and expecting to happen, and we were almost 100% positive that would happen. But when he sang these songs and that vocal, he was very much on top of his game, full voice, as you can hear.
Mm.
And but you know, he got dealt the wrong card in the end, obviously. So you know, I get choked up when I hear him sing, and it took me a while to listen to Black Star as just a piece of music. You know.
I feel the same way. Um, just to talk around the NDA, not at the NDA, as it were. Is that something that's come from the Bowie estate, just as a general protection against people sort of gossiping about that part of his life, or is it something about another project?
It originated with him. He just wanted people to he felt personal details, incidental details weren't important whatsoever. It was his music he wanted everyone to focus on. That's what his output is. That's what his reason for living was, to make this music. And to know what sandwich he ate the day he did that vocal is totally irrelevant. Nothing, you know, it just, I think, spoils the fun. Uh, so everyone had to do this, and everyone feels that there are some things, like I just told you. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that he was extremely happy when he was making this record. He was certainly he didn't even look ill. You know, he was in great shape. So, and part of that's due to the fact that he was living a dream he always had.
But that's interesting. So he was the person that was behind the idea of, you know, minimizing the chat around these sessions and maybe.
Well, yeah, it wasn't necessarily about these sessions in particular, but he was looking back on his career of what journalists have made of his life, you know, and like making a great album and then seeing something stupid or vile in print, or I don't, you know, he just gave up on the press. He just did not want to do interviews since, you know, I think after what was the Heathen and then Reality. I think he was finished with interviews after Reality. In fact, he said he wanted me to take the interviews for Reality. He didn't want to do them. He's just fed up with being, you know, speculation and
Yeah.
sensational journalism, and that's when it started. Absolutely, that's when it started.
And you can hear that. I feel as if he's saying some of that in that song, I Can't Give Everything Away, at the end of the Black Star album. That seems to be something about what it is to protect a kind of mystique around
Yeah.
body of work.
Well, that's the way he felt, just in black and white. You know, that song is true to the title.
Yeah, exactly. Now, should we have a couple more questions from some of the people watching?
Of
By all
course.
means, yes. We've got a lot on general. A lot of the vocalists you work with are big character vocalists. So obviously you've got Bowie, but you've also got Damon Albarn recently in The Good, the Bad and the Queen, and worked with Morrissey as well as Mark Bolan. How do you coax the best out of such confident vocalists with such a body of work behind them as a producer?
Oh, that's, you know, for me, that's a really a big job, because they are great. I mean, Damon Albarn has one of the best voices I've ever worked with. And so does Morrissey. But both of them hired me for a reason. You know, they hired me. I didn't go begging to work with them. So I have to. I mean, I just start like I treat them like anyone else. If I feel that something is out that they can do better, I will tell them. And with Damon was terrific to work with. He just wanted to make a great album, and uh, I'm not sitting there for I'm not sitting there for nothing. So he took everything well. I mean, he sings in tune. He sings with emotion. But I remember making lots of little suggestions that were taken well or not taken at all. You know, that's the way it works. I work with everyone the same way. Morrissey was different in the beginning. I mean, he had a lot of bad experiences with producers, yet he wanted to work with me. And possibly he was persuaded by his label that I would be the one to work with him. That would I would do. I would assuage his fears about being altered too much, you know. So I arrived in Rome and sat down with him and had a talk. And he said, when we're in the studio, there's only two things I want you to tell me, nothing else. And I said, okay, what are they? He goes, tell me if I'm singing too quietly or if I'm singing too loud. I said, okay. You know, I've traveled all this way. So I knew why he was saying this, and I'm not going to step on his toes, and I don't want to impose any of my beliefs or you know anything on him. But I'm doing a job. I produce records, and I have to make sure everything is done well. That's my job, and if it doesn't go well, I'm going to get the blame. So after a few days, I was telling him he could get a little closer to the mic or things like that. And then it was a natural evolution. I did make other suggestions about how he could I don't know sing with a little more volume just this section and not sing so and then bring it back and all that. Just a little bit of the interpretation, and it went really well. He was quite happy when he would come back from the studio and come back in the control room and hear his voice, and he was very happy that it was going well. I never had 1 second of conflict with him. Whereas I heard he would fire producers if he didn't like the shirt they wore. I'm telling you, I've heard these stories. So whatever I did, I didn't hurt his feelings. I made him feel good, and I'm very proud of that album.
It's an excellent album. It sounds amazing. One from a few students who have asked about getting over a brain block, a lack of inspiration to keep a project moving. You've come up against a brick wall. As a producer, what can you do to keep that session moving, Tony?
Usually it's strange that you might find it strange. I call a break because I think when things get too intense, people are slightly in this heightened state of hysteria, and which they're mildly covering up. And I think the best thing to do is call a break and regroup. I think creativity is done when the mind is more relaxed, not when it's in a heightened state of fear. So I just go like, sometimes I'll take the break. I say, look, I can't hold it any longer. I've got to go to the loo, and I'll take the break. And that might be a good excuse to make everyone say, oh yeah, I could use a cup of tea or something like that. And that really heals everything. You walk away from something for a little bit, and then you come back to it, and your mind is ready for the next move. You just can't work at a grinding, schedule and expect wonderful things to happen. Trust in, you've got it. It's in there. Everything you have, memories. They're all in your brain. They won't come to the surface unless you learn to walk away, relax, empty your mind, and then it gets filled up with inspiration again.
And are there specific routines that you like to indulge in the studio? Do you have a time that you always start working at and a time that you always knock off, or are you totally flexible?
I'm flexible, but I do like to keep strict hours because, for instance, like I like to work from 11 till 7. I like those hours. It gives me time to wake up early and do what I have to do to become a human being, which is 2 cups of coffee, a session of Tai Chi, and then I walk to work. I don't take a taxi or anything like that because I like to exercise. I know that's good for me to exercise, by the time I arrive at the studio before 11, I will either have an assistant setting up, but I'm ready to go. I am ready to go. And I like to take meals in the studio. I don't like to disperse the crowd out into the street and come back and they have to get all back into it again. And then, and I drive pretty hard. A lot of people are pretty much, when they work with me, they're wiped out by about 6 o'clock. And sometimes we'll leave early. But if someone's really on a roll, I'm not going to call the session off at 7 o'clock. I'll just work until the person, if they're finally feeling it at 7 o'clock, hell, I'm not going to walk out of the studio. So, but it's nice when you keep hours. It's like a job, like all other jobs. It's good. The discipline is good for creativity. That's what I find. I know great painters did the same thing. They'd wake up, they'd paint between certain hours. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, everyone has hours that they work. Because, think about it. Part of creativity is expressing what you've lived. And if you don't live, you have nothing to express. You've got to do a little living each day in order to come back and be creative.
Thank you. One more from students before we pass back over to Adam. Have there been any regrets within your career? Maybe people you haven't yet got to work with that you might want to expand on?
I don't know. I would have, back in the day, it would have been great to work with the Stones. I did work on a couple of projects with Mick Jagger and Bill Wyman. I did the Rock and Roll Circus. I don't know if you've ever seen that video.
Yeah.
I'm the guy who wrote all the circus music. So it was nice. I worked with him for a bit and had dinner with Mick a couple of times and with Bowie and all that. But apart from that, I think I've pretty much worked with some of the greatest artists in the world, like Esperanza Spalding was amazing to work with. And she was challenging. She was very, very challenging. I just wished I did the whole album with her, but I almost did because she came to the studio and just wanted to mix. She said, I want you to mix because I like the way your stuff sounds on the radio and all that. And I said, okay. And then she ended up re-recording everything. So the 2 weeks of mixing turned out to about 5 weeks of re-recording stuff. She'd go in the vocal booth, redo vocals. I sang some backups with her and all that. So that was fun. But because of her caliber of music, which is kind of quasi jazz, pop, I mean, it's funk. It's a whole bunch of genres she does very, very well. I had to be on my toes. I really did. It was quite challenging.
Thank you very much. Adam.
Well, as we come towards the end of our session today, I'm curious to take you back to some of those sessions for the album Low in 1976. Would that have been?
Yeah.
I think sort of towards the end of 76. Yeah, because it came out early 77, didn't it? I think.
Yes.
And so you were in the Chateau d'Herouville, aka the Honky Chateau, as per Elton John's album. We mentioned Gus Dudgeon earlier on. I think he produced that one. But how would you spend the evenings there at the Chateau? What's like if you're holed up in a residential studio with an artist who is going through a tough time emotionally, splitting up with his wife and his then manager, I believe, shuttling between Paris and the studio on legal business. And, how are you keeping your spirits up of an evening?
That was weird. That album, that studio you could descend in hedonism very easily. There was nothing to do there. There was very poor transportation between that studio and Paris. You would think, ooh la la, I'm in France, and I'm going to go to Paris every night for dinner. It was a dangerous B road that went to Paris, and there were no taxis in that area. This is 1976. It wasn't like, for all I know, that's a suburb of Paris now. But then it was hard to get to Paris. We might be able to get there once a week. So consequently, we took our 3 meals a day in that place, and the staff were always changing. You might get one week a great chef, and the next week some very indifferent people. There was no consistency in the running of that place. I ended up, and I think David too, we started growing beards, which we don't normally do. And then I stopped wearing shoes. Things like that's what I said. It sank to hedonism. And then in the night, we'd have dinner, and then all these beautiful bottles of Beaujolais would come out, and we'd get blind drunk, and that was all we could really do. There was no no television, no local bars. This was a real out in the woods residential studio, and they didn't provide any activities for us to do that with bar recording. So Mark Bolan had the right idea, because he was always had his finger on the pulse, like he paid the bills basically. We used the chateau for 3 days, where we worked 14 hours a day and did 16 tracks. And then we just got out of there quickly. And so, we didn't live there, but David didn't like to work all day long. And he, it's for him, he was always like on top of his game. So he could get a lot of work done in 5 hours, which would take normal people 10 hours to do. Like when he was done, and he wanted to relax. But our relaxation took the form of just knocking it down a few of those lovely bottles of Beaujolais. It was bad for us. It was bad for us.
Yeah. I think I heard Carlos Alomar talking about at some point watching a lot of Faulty Towers videos, but that couldn't have been there if there was no TV.
Oh, that was me. I brought a VCR, and this is the second time I had been there. Yeah. And my Faulty Towers VCR tapes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess comedy was a big thing for all you guys. There's lots of stories about Bowie and Eno conversing in their Derek and Clive voices. And I read in your book about you going off to see Peter Cook and Dudley Moore with Bowie one evening. And is that something that's still an important thing to you? Do you, over the years, have you consumed a lot of comedy in those recording sessions?
Oh, well. Oh, in the recording session, I don't know. David would go off sometimes on microphone. I mean, he was very funny. He's an entertainer, and he was more into towards the end Ricky Gervais.
Yeah.
And so we kept up with the times. Like when we saw The Office, he was having friends send him VHS tapes of The Office before it hit America. And we were watching the very first episodes of The Office and screaming with laughter in the studio. It was a long time. I forgot what album we were making, but whenever it first came out, it was very funny. And all the characters. And then when America brought out its own version, I had Ricky Gervais in my head. I couldn't switch over. But David always looked like Peter Cook, and he loved Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and that was a standby, that was always a standby.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about producing a comedy album the way that George Martin used to produce all those albums by Peter Sellers and people like that?
Oh, they are great albums. I saw a film that had all the goons in it the other night. It was a pretty bad film, but Harry Seacombe was in it. Even the tall guy with the baritone voice, all the goons were in it, and I think it sounded like George Martin must have made the music for the background of the film. But it was such a dreadful film, I couldn't see it to the end. It was about a boarding house in Brighton, and Harry Seacombe won £10,000 in the lottery. And, but anyway, I don't know. I'm going to leave the comedy albums to George Martin and anyone who wants to emulate him. I don't think I can make a comedy album.
Okay. I Googled Goons film and all I got was Goon from 2011 starring the one about sport. So that nothing to do with it. And what are you working on at the moment? Where are you, by the way, Tony? Are you in the UK at the moment, or?
No, I'm in New York City. This is my studio that I've been here since about 2011, even earlier, I think maybe 2010. And this is part of a composing and jingles company. My son is one of the owners of this company, and he gave his daddy a room. So this is my studio. I've got a vocal booth, a nice kitchen, and all that stuff. And this is where David did all his vocals for The Next Day and Black Star in this place. And so I've got an ISO booth to my left. I was always like, David was always about 5 feet away from me, singing his heart out into his golden manly microphone here. But I like this place a lot. And I've got several homes in the UK. Whenever I go back, which before the pandemic, I was going to the UK about 4 times a year. And one is my studio in Kingston University, which is called Visconti Studio. It was a studio built in the 80s, which fell into abandonment, and it had like plants growing inside from the outside, vines creeping up the walls. And the people who took over that studio just turned it into a gem. The sound is incredible. It's octagonal shape, 8-sided shaped walls, and the sound is great. And I work there. And I also work at Dean Street Studios, which in Soho, which is on Dean Street and Old Compton Street, which is my old studio where I did Scary Monsters with David Bowie and lots of other great albums. So the current owner is Alvin Lee's daughter and ex-wife. So and my daughter used to play with the Jasmine Lee when they were in school in Reading. So, I mean, I've got family and friends, probably more family and friends in the UK than I have in the United States. So I'm always back there. I'd like to go. I'd like to see this place next time I'm back, Nottingham University.
Yes, there you go. One day we'll be in rooms again, rather than going through endless Zoom tech tests.
I just see that Alvin Lee comes from Nottingham. Good on you. I'm seeing all these texts on my right here.
Now, do we have one more question to conclude, or are we out of time now?
Yeah, we've got a few on how you keep mentally well as a creative in 2021. We've got a lot of young people who struggle with mental health, and in the last year, obviously, everyone's been locked down, struggling for income, struggling to make ends meet. There's a lot of pressure on people without a regular 9 to 5 to stay well. Have you experienced anything like that with artists you've worked with, and any tips that we could end the interview with to stay well, prosperous for the future?
I think everybody has their personal way of dealing with this, and if you don't, you need to find something that can keep you sane. In my case, years ago, I studied with the same meditation teacher that David did, Tibetan Lama, who lived in London, come generally from Tibet. So I meditate, and I haven't forgotten how. And then in the 80s, I started taking up Tai Chi because, a life in music, if you don't watch it, it could be very decadent. And you know why. There are pitfalls everywhere. And it's easy to discover drugs that are, some drugs are recreational and some drugs are very, very harmful. And if you don't have a strong rooting outside of the music career, it could eat you, it could devour you. So I would say, like, I can only recommend meditation and Tai Chi. I used to be a runner too. I mean, any kind of a sport that keeps you fit is gonna help you. It keeps your mind better. It's good for you to feel good, and it's no secret. Endorphins are what makes us feel good. You have to make endorphins. That's my big secret. But take things in perspective. Music is great. Don't let it eat you up. Don't let it be 100% of your life. Leave 5% for like other things. 15%. You know what to do. I can't tell you what percentages, but I do know that staying healthy requires hard work as well. So
really, really good advice. Thank you. Well, it just remains to say thank you, both of you, for this really, truly unique event. Thanks for giving the time so willingly to our students.